Today I want to talk about the basic distinction between instinct and intellect and describe the relation between the two. So instinct is formed by the empiricism of Darwinian selection. So usually when we talk about empiricism, we're talking about a consciousness which is observing phenomenon and then forming a theory according to those observations. But when we talk about Darwinian selection, we're talking about what I view as a functioning neural network over a chronology. So when you look at the brain basically has a communication mechanism. And that communication mechanism is where you have these brain cells. They're sending electrical signals to one another. They're forming patterns. They're active. They're inactive. They're stimulated. They're not stimulated. And so they're able to hold memory, hold data in the same way that a computer can hold data, has a certain amount of memory. Well, Darwinian selection sort of does the same thing over a chronology. So Darwinian selection has certain inputs and outputs. So an input might be an environment. It could be a behavior. So we could say an input might be a dry, arid environment. And then a behavior might be hoarding. And this could be an animal that hoards resources. It could be a plant that hoards water. It's good at preserving water. It has like a hard outer shell, like a cactus, for example, and then it has water on the inside. So this hoarding behavior, when you input it with the other input of the dry, arid environment, the output, the result is that this hoarding behavior is reproductively successful within that environment. So there is this communication mechanism between the organism over time and between certain behaviors and certain environments and certain genotypes and their expression as phenotypes. So, a plant or an animal might try to have a certain behavior such as a hoarding behavior, but it might try to expand beyond its natural habitat into a different environment. Now, a hoarding strategy would not work well in the rainforest, right? So that plant or that animal is going to be outcompeted by those plants and animals which don't have a hoarding strategy. They have a different niche that they fit into. So over time there's this sort of call and response, input output, and I see that is essentially serving the same function that the neurons have their own function in the brain. Now the communication in the brain is a lot more rapid, but it's still the same basic process. There is a communication that is going on. There is an exchange. I mean, DNA is a symbol for a phenotype, right? So you have DNA, and the DNA sequence doesn't look anything like the behavior. You can't look at a patch of DNA and say, oh yes, of course, that is determining intelligence, or that's determining the rate of cell reproduction, or that's determining this or that. You can't look at the DNA. It's an encoding, it's a symbology. And so language and linguistics really starts with DNA. And it is a collectivistic thing. And because it deals with, it's intergenerational. DNA is incoherent if you don't have an intergenerational aspect. So the DNA, it's a language, there is a communication going on. And so it's Darwinian evolution, Darwinian selection, from my perspective, is really an empirical process. It's just happening over a longer span of time, and it's not happening within a closed system. It's an open system with many changing factors. It's not contained within a single organism or a single consciousness, but it actually sort of bleeds out over the entire ecosystem and different systems of ecosystems. So we could give some examples of instincts. Instincts could be the sex drive, right? And so most species on the planet have some form of a reproductive drive. For mammals, this is the sex drive. For humans, we have our own specific expression of the sex drive. And we have it because, again, over many, many generations, the sex drive proved itself to be a very good way to induce reproduction. If we didn't have a sex drive, and there are some people who don't, for medical reasons, they just don't have a sex drive, more common among women than men, but a lot of people actually don't have a sex drive, and you could probably see over many generations that these people tend to have less children, especially men. Women, historically not so much for reasons of, a patriarchal society, but in any case, the sex drive, especially for men, is very important for reproduction. And if you don't have that, usually that individual within the species isn't going to reproduce. So we could talk about another instinct would be a disgust for incest. Incest is disgusting, not because we're taught that culturally, but because it's in internal psychologically. I think it's called the Westermarck effect, that basically says if you grow up with somebody, you're going to be disgusted at the thought of sexual relations with them. So that's your parents, your siblings, and so on and so forth. So that's another instinct would be looking at people with facial asymmetry and being disgusted by them. So we're attracted to facial symmetry. That is a sign of genetic health. That's a sign that everything's going according to plan. If someone has a facial asymmetry, like one eye is up here and one eye is down there, and they're not level in their face, and there's some kind of gross asymmetry, we often find that disgusting or unappealing or unattractive. And so we understand that there are reasons for all these historical reasons, because again, the communication is slow. It's a slow process over time. Now, the problem with instincts is very basic. What if the environment, which was relatively stable for many millennia, suddenly and abruptly changed? And the key term I want people to understand here is punctuated equilibrium, that a lot of evolution doesn't happen slowly over time, but it actually happens in a punctuated, all of a sudden, there's a rapid change. There's a distinct phenotypical difference as a result possibly of a small genotypical difference. So obviously, in the case of a rapid environmental change, our instincts would no longer serve us. So we can imagine all kinds of instances in history in which we had an instinct which told us to do one thing, but then an environmental change came along and actually made those instincts deleterious rather than advantageous. So we can think in terms of food. Human species in general, especially Caucasians, Africans, Samoans, Polynesians, Asians are somewhat of an exception. They have a very carbohydrate-rich diet and they still maintain, slim athletic bodies. But especially Africans, mestizo populations, Caucasian populations, we have a huge sweet tooth. We like sugary things. We like fruits. And we like simulations of fruits. So we like cane sugar, we like corn syrup, we like candy. And this isn't really good for us. This makes us fat. It spikes our insulin, and the production of fat cells goes into overdrive, and we become obese. And obesity has a whole list of health problems, also psychological problems. If you're obese, you become unattractive. Your sex life is poor. Your job performance is sort of going down as a result of if you're slim, people are more likely to like you, they're more likely to promote you. And so there's just when we live in a socialized society, that is a society in which decisions are made according to social rank and value, and your obesity increases, your social rank decreases, and that basically harms you in every aspect of life, whether it's your career or your sex life or your friends or whatever. So we see that obesity is harmful, and we see that obesity is the result of us following our instinct of hoarding food, feasting. Now, this is, natural. If you look at Africa, Africans are not obese, by and large. They're not obese because they're still in an environment that is, part of its culture, part of its diet, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you eat processed foods, that's going to be different than if you're eating like organic foods, locally sourced foods. So, if it's loaded with corn syrup and loaded with cane sugar, that's different than if it's just the plain, Neolithic ingredients that your ancestors have been eaten for a very long time. And then you can go to the paleo diet, the Paleolithic diet, and so on and so forth. So, you're going to get different results, but basically, what leads people to obesity is not usually it's not their own perverse desire to hurt themselves. It's usually they're just following their instinct to eat yummy food, and that just turns out to have a bad effect because of a change in environment. Now, Paleolithic peoples, they were not obese. They had the same instincts we have today, but because of a sudden and rapid change in environment, now we have this rising obesity rate as a consequence. And we could talk about basically anything. We have instincts that developed in resource scarce conditions. So sex was a scarce resource. You maybe had a tribe, depending on what area of the world you're talking about, your tribe could be as small as 200 people. Of those 200 people, 100 might be male, 100 might be female. Again, depending on conditions. And then, let's say some of them are prepubescent, so they would not be suitable mating partners. Some of them might be post-fertility age. They might be over the age of 30 or 40 or 50. And so you really have a small, if you're a male, you really have a small number of potential mating partners. If 50% of the population is below age, whatever the age of puberty is, and that's been changing as well, but they're below the age of puberty, and then some of them are above the age of last menarche, they're postmenopausal women, then you're maybe talking about 50 individuals, and then you talk about genetic defects, you talk about bell curves of intelligence, athletic ability, and so on. So you're really looking at maybe you have 50 individuals to choose from, and then the fact that you're living in a tribal setting, everyone's so closely related to each other, you might have within your immediate family 10 women. We're talking about mothers, sisters, cousins, so on, first cousins. So you kind of want to marry out as much as possible someone who's not your first cousin, if possible. And that's really restricting the number of females that you can actually mate with at any given time. And so sex was something that was extremely scarce. There would be very, very few women that you could ever have sex with in your life, unless you went to war with a neighboring tribe and you kidnapped their females and raped them. But besides that, within your tribe, endogenously, in your whole lifetime, you might be the chattiest chat out there, you might be the alpha male of the group, but still, you might be limited, even in a fairly large tribe, in a Paleolithic tribe, you might be limited to maybe 50 women in your whole lifetime. Now, compare that to pornography today, where you can look and you can simulate sex with 50 women in a 5-minute time frame, or however, that quantitative change is enormous in terms of resource scarcity of sexual resources, psychologically and instinctually. It's paralleling the increase in sugary foods that we have today, processed foods, sugar cane, corn syrup. We could talk about entertainment in general. If you're a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, yes, it would be exciting to go hunt out, woolly mammoths. It would be exciting to go to war. You wouldn't be doing that the majority of your time. Now, with video games, you can simulate war, for 10 hours a day if you want. You can watch movies over and over again. So, the life that people lead now, there's a lot more visceral stimulation in terms of sex, in terms of violence, in terms of drama. You can watch soap operas and whatever. And women do have a form of pornography. It's the romantic novel. And they will read things like romantic novels or watch Hollywood Disney princess movies. Disney princess movies are basically pornography for women. They're not realistic. They're not really healthy. They're not natural relationships. Again, it's as fantastical as the man watching the gangbang porn or whatever. Choose your fetish, however you want to frame it. So obviously we have instincts that were built for deprivation. Our society has changed. We're now an abundance society. We have an abundance of anything you could ask for. In a post-capitalist Western society, you have all the sex, all the drugs is huge. I didn't even touch on drugs, but drugs, of course, just directly inject dopamine into you. Now, ancestors had access to drugs. We had access to perhaps psychedelic mushrooms. We had access perhaps to forms of marijuana, forms of opiates, forms of poppy. So we might have had access to drugs that would make us feel good, that would be medicinal herbs, that would cause us to have psychedelic experiences. There's also, certain cultures that are brain-eating cultures, and eating brains can actually cause you to get a disease. But, eating brains could have been part of ancestral rituals in certain parts of the world. So there's a lot of things we could do to mess with our psychology chemically, but drugs have made it infinitely easier. They've removed the ritualistic aspect of it, and they've made it just a daily occurrence. You can just get high every day, drunk every day. Of course, yeah, there was alcohol in ancient Europe. We've been drinking alcohol for a very long time, but the extent to which we drink alcohol today is a lot more readily accessible, a lot cheaper than it used to be. So we have an abundance environment, but instincts built for deprivation, and that's a collision course for disaster for a lot of people who have low self-control, who have low executive function. That's the majority of people have some problem in their life, either with procrastination, they're not able to do what they want to do, addiction to stimulation, addiction to drama, addiction to attention, extreme narcissism, extroversion. I mean, we call these mental disorders and diseases, but really they're more the norm than they are the exception, right? I mean, think of people in your life, and you can think of someone who, yeah, that person probably drank more in their college days than was healthy. Probably did some damage to their liver. Probably could have been doing something productive with that time. Probably could have enjoyed themselves more in terms of satisfaction, right? Maybe they, in that period, they got wild and crazy, and that was a good experience, but doing that over and over again, perhaps they did too much. And I'm not saying everyone does that, but some people might go overboard with alcohol, some people might go overboard with marijuana, that it inhibits their productivity. And when you die, it's kind of a pathetic thing to say, oh man, I wish I smoked more weed. It's like, well, don't you wish you helped people more, you contributed more to society, or it left your mark on the world? Just ingesting a substance or inhaling a substance that makes you feel fuzzy, warm feelings, the idea that you wish you had more hours of hedonistic self-indulgence rather than doing something to leave a legacy on this earth, or to increase your chances of having a better reincarnation, that's kind of pathetic. If that's your mindset, is I wish I had smoked more weed. So of course we all know people who have smoked too much weed. We all know people, including ourselves, who probably watched too much porn, probably spent too much time dedicated directly to sex, and have that be unfulfilling. I mean, it's a stereotype at this point. A person who if they had spent their life working on making themselves a good person, that is a sociable person, a person with a good career, a person who is athletic, right? Attractive qualities for women. This person probably could marry a woman who is attractive and have kids and have a good life. And you look at the little habits and the little choices people make. If you just spend 1 hour a day getting physically fit, and 1 hour a day meeting people, being sociable, 1 hour a day working on your career skills, working on your finances. So that's 3 hours a day, and there are probably people who instead of spending those 3 hours in that way, they're spending their 3 hours of free time on pornography, on alcohol, on marijuana, right? Things of this nature. And they're probably, that you could spend a lot of time trying to lose weight because you're eating the wrong food, or you could just eat right? So again, the executive function of self-control in most people does not overpower the base instincts. The base instincts that formed historically to be advantageous within a historical environment. It's not as if God or Satan came down and filled us with all these evil instincts. And that is a kind of a problematic narrative that's common in Christian churches. In Christian churches, they'll say things like, the devil fills us with laziness and the devil fills us with lust and blah, blah, blah. And that's not true. It's not necessarily, I don't think it's really accurate to look at human nature and human instincts in this purely negative way of it's just all evil and you have to hate it. But we can understand humans, we can sympathize and empathize and say, look, these instincts that we have were really built to preserve us. Laziness is really just conservation of energy. Lust is really meant to carry on the species. Gluttony is really meant to store up reserves so that if there is a time of hunger or starvation, we can survive. And we can go down the list, coveting what others have, so that we are motivated to build up our own resources. Theft and warfare were a necessary strategy in times of resource scarcity. Murder was necessary sometimes to establish dominance or to resolve conflicts that otherwise would have paralyzed a tribe. And a murder might have resolved a conflict that otherwise would have led to the destruction of the whole tribe, right? You have two alpha males, and one says we should travel north and one says we should travel south. And if you just stay where you are, the tribe's going to die. Well, maybe they have a contest of arms, and one of them, murders the other. And that's really what's necessary at some point. So, you can go down the list of sins of murdering and coveting and lusting and lying and all of these things, and you can see where they are life-driven instincts. But of course, you change the environment, and then you change the meaning of these. I mean, even deception and manipulation. We consider today actors and actresses people who can deceive others well, people who can create emotions which are not really there. I mean, when an actress or an actor cries or they're happy, they are simulating an emotion. They're creating a narrative, and we as the viewer consider that to be beautiful, a beautiful work of art, and we might applaud them and say that's a wonderful masterpiece, and people worship celebrities as if they're gods and aristocrats. But really, that is nothing more than manipulation and lying. And so something that was, I guess, perceived as evil is now perceived as one of the highest skills that you can have. So, is this relativism? Well, it's relativism to the extent that a certain environment has a certain, input-output system. And so if you take the instinct for gluttony and you put that into a resource-scarce environment, it's going to be a strong behavioral instinct. It's going to work well with that environment. It's going to produce reproductive success. But if then you change the environment, all of a sudden that input, that instinct for gluttony, doesn't work so well anymore. It's not benefiting people. In fact, it's harming people. And so instincts, from my mind, they're really a language. And language does change depending on context. And changes an environment, the language also has to change. So, if that's relativism, that language has to change in response to changes in the environment, then I guess, it's relativism. I don't really care how you define it, but I see it, you can call it objective, some kind of objective perspective, because you're saying, look, with respect to a deprivation environment, gluttony is good. With respect to an abundance environment, gluttony is bad. And so we have like a definite answer there with respect to, reproduction. Now, happiness comes into the equation. The problem when we talk about all this is that it used to be that if a person was happy, they were usually reproducing. Now we're in a state where actually a lot of people who are reproducing a lot of kids aren't necessarily happy. A lot of people who are happy might be childless. So there is now a dissonance. Even then, our emotional system used to drive us toward reproduction. It's not necessarily doing that today. So again, instincts are really good. And I'll give an example of when instincts are really good. Let's say the environment suddenly changes, but it's temporary. So it's not a paradigm shift. It's not punctuated equilibrium. What's going on instead is that there is a staccato event. There is an event which is an abrupt, sudden change, but it is an isolated event. And so let's give an example. Let's say that humans are living in an environment, it's a deprivation environment, and then one year there's a great harvest, and so there's plenty of food, everyone's getting fat. So would it be a good idea, again, would it be a good idea then for everyone to stop being gluttonous? Would it be a good idea for everyone to change their instincts and to say, well, we had plenty of food last year, so we should stop being gluttons, we should stop seeking after food? No, that wouldn't be a good idea at all, because that one good harvest was an isolated event. And so the next year, when there's a deprivation again, you need that instinct for gluttony to keep the human tribe going, to keep, for the optimal reproductive success. You need that drive for food, that desire for food, that feasting and fasting. So when you have an isolated event, instincts are good, because instincts do not respond well to sudden changes. And so instincts are really actually good in preserving long-term beneficial behaviors and not changing in response to short-term isolated aberrations. And so, again, there are many examples where that would be helpful. And when we look at the current environment that we're in, basically you have people like the Amish who are living a Neolithic lifestyle. They haven't really adopted the modern world. And so these people, by and large, are living according to genetic instincts as well as, I would say, mimetic instincts. These are not instincts written into our genes, but these are instincts formed by religion. And I view religion and I study it according to, it's a field of mimetics. Religious study is a study of mimetics. And so you have, our genetic instincts, and then you also have these mimetic instincts that are not written in the DNA, but they're written in something like the Bible, or they're written in an oral tradition, or they're written and encoded in some kind of religious text or ritual or symbology. Okay, so these instincts haven't changed much. The Amish haven't changed much. And the Amish are reproductively successful. They have like 8 kids on average per woman. But are the Amish going to be able to survive in a situation where there is civil unrest or mass violence, or let's say the government decides to crack down on the Amish? Can the Amish resist? The Amish don't really have the ability to deal with the modern world, whereas you take another religious minority group like the Mormons. Well, the Mormons have infiltrated the FBI, the CIA, so the Mormons have this disproportionate influence. I mean, Mitt Romney, good example of a Mormon who ran for president, and he could have won the presidency. It was within his grasp. He actually won more of the white vote than Trump. So he was actually more attractive to white people than Donald Trump. So if white people were just racist, then that wouldn't be the case. But obviously that's not the case. So in any way, the Mormons are much better equipped to deal with the threat of a central government or a corporate threat or some kind of threat from the modern world. The Mormons are more equipped to deal with that because they interact with the system in a significant way, and they do have sway within systems of government and corporate systems, whereas the Amish really don't have any allies. They don't have any assets outside of their Neolithic lifestyle, their traditional conservative lifestyle. So, if the modern world is just a blip, and some people believe that. People like Ted Kaczynski, I think, is a really good example of this. And I want people to read Ted Kaczynski, and I want them to understand him, because I think he was wrong. And we have to understand how he was wrong, and we have to understand that he's really one of the best defenders of his position. And he takes it to the logical conclusion. Most people don't. And they have ideas like Ted Kaczynski's, but they don't actually fully develop them. And so, because they've not fully developed them, they don't actually understand the logical inconsistencies of that position. And so they end up believing something like, well, we lived in a Neolithic time, and now we're in sort of a post-Neolithic time, an era of abundance, and this is just temporary, and eventually we're going to go back to a Neolithic time. That's not accurate, in my opinion. But if it was accurate, then we could describe the era of abundance that we now live in. We could describe it as a staccato event. We could describe it as a blip in history. And at some point, we're going to return to that Neolithic period. So that's and some people have suggested that we're even going to return to Paleolithic times. I don't think that's accurate, but people, feminist theorists have suggested that farming is going to go the way of the dinosaurs. That these are the two opinions. Now, if we move on to intellect is a lot easier to understand than instincts. Intellect uses the empiricism of observation. So this is a conscious observer looking at events and forming theories about them. So here's some examples. We could use our intellect to observe that sperm banks are actually really good at conferring reproductive success. You could donate to a sperm bank and you could have thousands of children theoretically. Now, a sperm bank might only use your sperm for 1 or 2 donors or something, or no donors, right? So this is just a theoretical, hypothetical situation, but we can imagine a scenario in our post-abundance society in which you could use your intellect to become the biggest donor to a sperm bank, and then you could have many more children, much more reproductive success than someone who uses traditional methods, someone like the Amish, right? Then another one would be, we could observe that manipulation of the stock market actually confers wealth, and it allows for a lot of intergenerational success. So you look at a family like the Rothschilds, who have been working in finance for hundreds of years, and Mayer Rothschild, he was one guy, but he has all these sons and grandsons and granddaughters, and the Rothschild family is really this huge family, and they've had a lot of reproductive success, right? And it's not because they live like the Amish, farming the land. It's because they understood stock markets, and so they were able to get a lot of wealth, and their wealth allowed them to gain more wealth and to have all these descendants who then spread over the world and have their own little nepotistic networks, and that's a very good survival strategy, and it's not really the traditional survival strategy. So these strategies really are a result of intellect and not instinct. And you basically have two competing strategies here. One is the strategy of instinct and one of intellect. And the problem of instinct is instincts don't respond well to changes in environment, especially not permanent changes. So if the environment changes quickly, like there's 1 year of a good harvest and then it goes back to normal, then instincts are going to win out. But if you have a situation where there's a sudden change and it's a permanent change, it's a persistent change, then in that case, instincts are really going to become more of a liability. And in that case, you want intellect. Now, the problem of intellect is it can fall prey to inaccurate data. So a lot of people have made projections about things like global warming. And a lot of very smart scientists, now we can question their motivations, but I think there are a lot of smart people who were convinced that by the year 2000, that Florida was going to be underwater. Now that hasn't come to pass. And now there are a lot of other smart people who think Florida will be underwater by 2050. Now these projections, they can be made by smart people, and they can affect huge changes in behavior. So Macron in France, he had this gas tax. People rioted against it. But the idea of the gas tax was, hey, our major cities are going to be underwater, coastal cities will be underwater unless we act now to curb our fossil fuel emissions. There are a lot of very, very smart people who believe in the theory of global warming. The problem is you're going to change the entire global economy based on this idea, this theory, and what if your theory is based off faulty data, biased data, data that's being funded by malicious actors, and so can you really trust in the data? So, intellect, very smart people can believe in very dumb things. Smart people can convince themselves of very dumb things using, consistent cognitive bias in analyzing data. So, we're kind of in a point where there is a relation between instinct and intellect. If you just want to completely abandon all your instincts, you're going to appear to the majority of people as a antisocial person. We view social relations through the paradigm of instincts, and this global capitalist system that we live in, we judge people's financial value according to a great degree that's determined by their social value. Now, there's some cases where you could say, oh, there's some whiz kid in the stock market and he's just trading stocks, but he's really antisocial. I mean, you could talk about Carl Icahn, you could talk about George Soros, you could talk about these people who aren't necessarily very handsome, they're not necessarily very sociable, although I would dispute that. I think they have their own charisma within their own circles, but still, you can at least imagine a scenario in which someone who's very smart gains a lot of money, not because they're a sociable person, but because they're simply intelligent and they manipulated the stock market or they invented something. Elon Musk is another example of someone who's like, well, he doesn't have the best social, or I think Bill Gates is probably the best example. Bill Gates, people think he's autistic or that he has Asperger's, and yet he's really rich. Basically because he was able to manipulate copyright law to have a monopoly over early computer software, and anyone who tried to create something similar, he just sued them and gained this monopoly, and that's how he got his money. So he manipulated the legal system. He's not actually, terribly bright. He's not actually terribly sociable, but he got a lot of money. So we can imagine that, but on the whole, even though there are these individual exceptions, I think on the whole, most of the time when you look at who are the big earners, well, the biggest earners are CEOs, and CEOs are social people. They're people who are perceived as leaders. Now, in some cases, the perception of leadership is actually more important than your ability to actually affect change. You're more likely to be hired as a CEO if people perceive you as a good leader than if you're actually have some good idea or something. And so you study CEOs, and CEOs tend to be tall because people who are tall tend to be perceived as good leaders. They tend to be fit, they tend to be athletic, because again, people who are athletic tend to be perceived as good leaders, and so on and so forth. So in order to interface with the financial system that we have, we understand that our social wealth, our social value, is really influenced by a lot of these psychological instincts that people have that really don't have to do with current present day conditions, but they have a lot to do with prehistoric or Neolithic or Paleolithic environments and conditions. So, my argument is basically that we're in a post-Neolithic paradigm shift. Now, people still do hunting and gathering in the Amazon, they still do it in Africa, but for the most part, we have transitioned from a Paleolithic mode to a Neolithic mode. And what I'm suggesting now is that we're transitioning from a Neolithic mode to a post-Neolithic mode. What do we call that? I'm not sure. What do we call it? The age of the internet? When exactly did it start? Did it start in the Industrial Revolution? When we talk about the transition from the Neolithic to the or from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, it's not something that happened in one day or 1 year or even a century. It happened actually over the course of thousands of years. And you could even call that period the Mesolithic. So the period that we're now in is a transitory period. We're in a transition period, and this means that we haven't quite escaped the Neolithic, but we haven't actually quite entered into this new thing, but we're in this transition period, and I think it will be a permanent transition, in the same way that the Neolithic ultimately was a permanent transition. The Neolithic wasn't an aberration, it wasn't an experiment, it wasn't just something, it wasn't a staccato event, it was a punctuated equilibrium in human development. And I think we're now approaching another one of those. Now, of course, people still do go out with guns and they hunt deer, and people can even take bows and arrows and hunt deer. The fact that we still see people engaging in Paleolithic behaviors as a matter of instinct or for fun or for sport doesn't mean that the Paleolithic age hasn't ended. Paleolithic is over. Even though we see many shadows of its existence, we still see vestigial aberrations of the what else might we call them? We might call them echoes of the Paleolithic period. We are still seeing a huge amount of Neolithic echo. And so, you can't understand the modern world if you don't understand what came before it, because we're living in this transition period. And so to act as if there's no value in Neolithic life and Neolithic instincts is not accurate. According to the capitalist system, we put a huge amount of value in how someone looks, their face, their physique. All of that matters to an extraordinary degree, to the point where this is the determination between whether you're going to earn a six-figure salary or whether you're going to be in poverty. Now, again, there are individuals who do use their intellect. They become engineers, computer programmers, and they can be fat and they can be ugly and still make a lot of money. But on the whole, if you average it out and you look at the entire system, things like facial structure, facial development, your physique, all of that impacts your earning potential on a statistical basis. Now, again, this is like IQ. It's even harder to measure than IQ. IQ at least is a quantitative number that we can look at, and we can compare against all sorts of other metrics, and we can study it as a number. But facial attractiveness is a lot harder to quantify. But I'm very much convinced that it has a huge amount to do, and you could call that pseudoscientific. Fine. Whatever. I don't have the quantitative data to back it up, but we're getting closer and closer with facial analysis. We are going to be at a point where a computer can analyze your face. You can just take a picture of your face, and a computer will tell you how attractive you are on average, and it could even specify it by culture. It could say, well, according to this culture. And then you could select people, like sample people. You could say, well, this person is the average woman living in Taiwan, and she finds your face this number attractive out of 10. This is your average African woman living in Namibia, and she finds your face this much attractive. And then you could do it for men, because men also evaluate each other's attractiveness, if not on a sexual level, at least on a social level, in terms of how you determine social hierarchies. And so again, you could say, well, here's how the Namibian man perceives you. He perceives you to have this level of aggressiveness, this level of attractiveness, this level of dominance, so there are all these social factors that people extrapolate from the face. And then you also have the physique, which adds another layer of complication. But we're getting closer and closer to the point where we can turn this qualitative phrenology and physiognomy into quantitative stuff that we'll be able to study, and people are going to do meta-analysis of this, and there's going to be gene editing, and all of this stuff is coming. And I guess if you don't think it's coming, you are some form of a Kaczynski. You are on some wavelength. You have something in common with Ted Kaczynski. Now, you might not go as far as Ted Kaczynski. You might say, oh, well, we're going to still have technology, but we're going to be like nationalist with technology, or we're going to be tribalist with technology. But I think things are changing in a permanent way. Just because things are changing doesn't mean that the Neolithic and even the Paleolithic are irrelevant. We still have to understand that if we want to be successful within the current capitalist system, we have to understand how our very long human history of tribalism, racialism, ethnocentrism, how this has influenced us. Now, people who get autistic and they look at something like race and they say, like, this is a pillar, this is a foundational part of human psychology that we can plant our feet on, and we are going to be in a firm position to found states and political ideologies and movements, and this is really the stable thing, because as Nietzsche said, God has died, God is dead, and we no longer have this stable foundation on which to plant our feet when organizing society. And so you have a lot of atheists or people who call themselves Christians but really have a very post-Christian outlook on everything. I mean, they're steeped in this post-Christian media. So even if someone calls themselves a Christian, their mindset and their psychology is radically different from the average Christian living in the medieval period. And so these people, they have no more faith in God or church or institutions in general, because everything's changing so rapidly. I mean, governments are becoming small and insignificant compared to something like Google. And so you're talking about people who have no faith in anything, and yet it is a fundamental human instinct to want familiarity, tribalism, in-group, continuity, stability. These are things that we really want. And people find that because all the other institutions like the church have fallen away, people find that in something like ethno-nationalism, the ethno-state, and we're going to be white nationalists. And I just think that just firmly planting yourself in that, in an autistic way, in an explicit way, it would be like how the Native Americans refused to farm like white people, and they just firmly planted their feet in their Apache tradition, or Apache, however you say it. Like, we're the warriors of the plains, and this is our sacred land, and we won't let you farmers, white farmers, come in. And these people who were not willing to adapt ultimately failed. And that's how I see white nationalists. The mindset is very similar to Native Americans. Now, I've recognized this for a while, and I'm a person who sympathized with Native Americans. And so as someone who's not Native American, I sympathized with them, and then I tried to translate that to my own identity. And then I said, oh, well, if the Native Americans, stuck their feet, planted it in the ground and said, we're not going to change, we're going to be who we are, and we're going to stand by our people, and we're going to reject these foreign invaders. If that's the Native American way, then maybe that's the way white people should be as well. But ultimately, I think history teaches us that simply standing fast and clinging to your identity and your way of life doesn't always turn out well, and sometimes it relegates you to a reservation. And we do see reservation in West Virginia. There are white ghettos. There are places where poor white people live. I mean, you can look at South Africa. The whites who were unable to adapt to the changing conditions of South Africa now live in ghettos outside of Orania. Orania is sort of the model white state, but outside of that, you have two classes of white people: the white people who are able to change, and those are the models and the athletes and the CEOs and the business people. And then you have people who were not willing to change. Those were basically the people who are now living in ghettos, who are being quote-unquote genocided. And you have the farmers, even very rich farmers, who are under attack. So, various groups of white people, some were able to make the transition, other people were not. And it really had to do with their ability to adapt mentally to changing ideology. Were they willing to go along with state ideology and adopt an explicitly anti-white position in order to preserve themselves? So we're seeing a world in which people who are willing to go post-tribal in a lot of ways are themselves they're sort of within a capitalist system. They are financially successful. They're more successful than people who are clinging to their identity, and that has to do not just with intelligence, but I think it is correlated with intelligence. Your mental flexibility, your plasticity, the extent to which you're willing to change, adopt new positions, adopt contradictory positions. I think intelligent people are a lot better at changing their moral code, or contriving or understanding contrived abstract moral code, something like anti-whiteness. I think people who have a low intelligence or just low IQ will say these people have a harder time adopting anti-white positions because they can't wrap their mind around the paradoxical self-hatred that it entails, whereas intelligent people are able to view it from this third position of like, well, yes, I'm white, but my whiteness doesn't matter, and actually I'm ideologically anti-white. And so we see these economies going on, we see these changes happening, and the question is, what is the future? Things are changing rapidly. Things will continue to change because, as I've said, we're in a transition period. We're in a post-Neolithic society. The values, the religious memes, everything that we think of is either Paleolithic in origin, all of our instincts, or Neolithic in origin. We're now in a position where we're forming new religions, new instincts. The idea of human rights is a new mimetic system. The idea of respecting LGBTQ rights, respecting the reproductive rights of women. This is a new mimetic system, and you have young people who are being brought up to think that homophobia is like satanic. which is a really weird thing if you think about this transition period we're going through. But we are going through a transition period. Again, the question is, who is going to come out on top? Well, it's going to be different depending on which century you're looking at. The mores and the values of the 20th century are going to be viewed as fascistic by the people of the next century. Even the people who fought fascism, they're going to view Churchill and FDR and all these people as fascistic. And so really, the strategies, the moral strategies that are going to be best are going to change all the time. Like our moral system, our memetics, our linguistics, they're in flux, and they're not going to stop in flux. It's not as if you're gonna come to this system of ethno-nationalism, and that's going to be the stable system that you can refer to, and you can have trust in it, you can have faith in it. That would be very convenient if that was the case, because that's how the Neolithic and even the Paleolithic, that you had environments that were relatively static, where tribal life was relatively consistent and things were just relatively the same day in and day out. And I think that's why people like astrology, for example, that the stars are very, very predictable. They move in a very predictable way. The seasons change, the solstice, the equinox, it all relates to one another in a mathematical, consistent way. And so it's something that you can sort of, if you want to put your faith in astrology, you can at least have confidence that the stars, day in, day out, they're going to operate pretty much in the same way that they always have. We don't live in a world like that anymore, which for humans is very unfortunate, because for a long time our ancestors could count on the fact that the instincts and the memetics and the religious outlook of their ancestors was going to be something that could work for the present generation and for the generations coming. That's not the case. Everything is changing. And so, we're living in a time where basically the most mercurial people, the people who are most able to change their psychology, the people who don't need stability, the people who don't need familiarity, the people who don't need all of those things, they're going to be the successful ones. They're going to come out on top. The people who cannot tolerate change are going to die. That's not always the case. If you look back historically, the most successful people were sometimes the people who were the best able to perfect tradition. Okay? Because, take warfare, for example, or hunting. The weapons available were not changing year after year. They were pretty much the same. You had spears and swords and whatever, but they were pretty much staying the same. And so, as far as the battleground went, the person who could change the most was not the most successful. The person who adhered to the warrior tradition the best, who actually were the most conservative-minded, those were the people who won the war. Now we're living in this post-industrial society, and you actually look at that things, and I want to do a video on this. I want to do a video on looking at different technological and anthropological developments and how that affected world history. I mean, it's huge, right? But I want to do the most zoomed out picture and just show the grand scale of it so people can get an idea and get a sort of reference point for understanding the current transition that we're going through. I mean, the Mongols had a revolutionary mounted archer technology, and that revolutionized warfare. The Indo-Europeans, I believe, had this chariot technology, and that revolutionized warfare. That's kind of in dispute, but someone brought along the chariot, and they revolutionized warfare. So there were these revolutions in warfare. Excuse me. There were these revolutions in warfare, and they did introduce transition periods, and they introduced periods of the dissolution of empires, the creation of empires, and we're seeing now just series after series of transitions and revolutions. And the conservative-minded person, the traditionalist-minded person is losing hard in a number of ways, unlike any other period in human history. The rate of change, the pace of change, quantitatively, qualitatively, the environmental, psychological change that we're going through is greater than anything I could ever conceive of. again, but we do want to reference past changes in history to at least get a grip on, okay, let's at least have something we can form an analogy for the present situation to orient ourselves to understand what's going on. But the good thing I think about all this is that we can still find value in tradition, at least to the subjective extent that people perceive tradition as valuable. Even if it doesn't have any present value given the nature of the post-Neolithic period, people still value athletic bodies. Even though you don't need an athletic body to be a computer programmer, which is pretty much the only job that's going to matter coming soon. Things like computer programming. Even though you don't need an athletic body to, go to war or to fight predators or whatever, people still value that. And so there's still value in the athletic tradition of the Greeks in gymnastica. So we can still interface with tradition. There's still value in tradition because we value it. Conservatism is valuable to the extent that people are conservative, not because it's a good survival strategy in a post-Neolithic period, but simply because that instinct is extremely persistent. It's, once you've been doing something for millennia or even millions of years, it's very hard to uproot that instinct. And people who are totally divorced from their instincts are not going to be the most successful people. I mean, look at Mark Zuckerberg. He's awkward. He's like autistic. He's sociopathic. You just look at him. You look at his face. You look at his facial inspection. And it's not just because, of his ancestry. There are plenty of people of his tribe who are good actors, who are good with their emotions, who are good, who are handsome, who are charismatic. He is not one of them. He is just like a lizard person, a robot person. He's never going to be president of the United States. Hillary Clinton has a kind of a similar problem in that she seems very plastic. She seems robotic. She seems corporate. She seems scripted. She's not natural in her language. And so people don't perceive her as being genuine versus someone like Trump or Bernie Sanders or whatever. So, just because we're in a transition period, I'm not saying become a computer programmer. I'm not saying like transhumanism or the idea that you should just go be a stockbroker or you should just be an accountant or you should just basically become one with Google and the corporate machine. It's not really the case. The people who are best paid at Google are not the computer programmers. The computer programmers at Google are on the lowest rung. They're down there with the janitors. The people at the top are the human resource managers, the people who govern morality, the people who look like leaders, the people who can give motivational speeches, the con men, the people who interface with instincts. So instincts are still key. They're still king. They're still king. They still put you at the top. So we can understand instincts. There's still value in them. So there's value in an ethnic and a racial analysis of history. There's value in evaluating people. When you look at people, understanding the whole picture of who a person is. The colorblind conservative, that might be the best explicit political strategy. But in terms of how you personally live your life, it's probably good to use that kind of information. But again, to be autistic, to be like a Mark Zuckerberg or a Bill Gates, again, these are people who are very rich. But I think at the end of the day, this is not the type or class of people who ends up really succeeding, really controlling things. You look at, broadly speaking, the people who have done best in a failing economy, in a recession, are the CEOs. Despite the fact that everything in the economy was contracting, the wages of CEOs continued to increase. And I think they are a class of people, by and large, who are not good at engineering. They're not good at problem solving. They're really not good at doing anything except having the appearance of being a leader. And the appearance of being a leader comes from our ancestral Paleolithic and Neolithic tradition. So, that's what follows. And you look at media. Media is so important. Or who becomes the general, who in the army. It's not the person who's physically the toughest. It's the guy who's the best intellect. and it's a social intellect. It's an emotional intelligence. It's not a strict problem solving intelligence. It's not just an analytical intelligence. The analytical intelligence, he might make a 6-figure salary, but he's never going to make a 7-figure salary. Essentially, what I'm saying. So, the top 10%, that might be your engineers, but the top 1%, those are your CEOs. And you look at media, you look at PewDiePie. PewDiePie, his talent is not analytical intelligence. His talent is he has an attractive face, and he's a sociable person. People want to be his friend. What he's selling with his channel is artificial simulated virtual friendship. He's not selling intellectual data. He's not selling an analysis. He's not selling intelligence. He's selling his friendship. People want to be friends with PewDiePie. He has the physiognomy and the personality that people want to be friends with him. That's why they subscribe. That's how he gets his money. So, that's just one example. What's the other one? T-Series. T-Series is about Indians peddling their music. Music taps into something very irrational and ancestral. So, all the sources of making money in the world are not through analysis. They're not through resource acquisition. And resource acquisition is mostly just so that we can eventually do something irrational with it. Like we want a car, and a car, you have to mine the iron and you make the steel, and you have to construct the car, and you need these robots to make it. Ultimately, you don't want the car for practical purposes. You want it so you can get to a job, so you can make money, so you can have sex with someone, or so you can have friends, or so, at the end of the day, all this practical stuff that people talk about is the real meat and potatoes of the economy. All of that serves some kind of irrational purpose, or some kind of pre-internet, pre-analytical purpose, some pre-conscious purpose. We want to have friends, we want to have sex, we want to have music, we want all these Neolithic and Paleolithic things that have nothing to do with what's practical and pragmatic in the 21st century and beyond. So that's what the economy is centered around. And so there's great value in understanding the Paleolithic. There's great value understanding the Neolithic. There's great value in understanding tradition, interfacing with tradition. But again, don't be autistic about it. Don't go full, white nationalist, ethno-statist about it. You can understand ethnicity, you can understand race, you can interface with that, and that can help you be successful. But ultimately, that's, again, it's like taking it's like going full Amish. And people admire the Amish, and they're consistent, right? They're loyal to their instincts. But if there really is a paradigm shift going on, sticking with your instincts is not going to be the people who succeed. The people who give birth to the next age are not going to be people who stick with their instincts. And so you do have to question your instincts. You do have to overcome your instincts if you want to succeed in a paradigm shift. Now, again, if I'm wrong, then you don't have to stick with your instincts. Or you do. I guess if I'm wrong, you do stick with your instincts. If I'm wrong, then you can just forget about trying to succeed within capitalism, and you can just go have 8 kids and live a traditional Christian life. If I'm wrong, then that's that radical traditionalism is the way to go. But if I'm right, then you really are going to want to have to be adaptable. But that doesn't mean throwing away tradition, which is what a lot of the left have done. Is they've thrown away tradition to their own detriment. You do have these leftist harpies and these women who are fat and who have some kind of position within the college system. But other than that, people don't like fat women. People don't like fat women with problem glasses and ugly purple hair and red lipstick. People don't like these fat, ugly, tattooed women who hate men. People don't like that. And so even though they are these priestesses of this new religion in the transition period, these people, ultimately, these are not going to be the most successful women. The most successful feminists are actually going to be skinny feminists who appeal to men and to other women as well. No one likes fat women. So even though they succeed within a college context, the idea that we're going to have an inversion of values, and it does happen to an extent, right? There are certain inversions of values, but we have to see the broader meta picture in which still the CEO, the top wage earners of society, on average, statistically, not just looking at the edge cases of Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, because of course those are edge cases, but in the general case, we're talking about CEOs who are athletic, they are tall, they are attractive, they are sociable. So these are the traits that are still successful, right? We are not completely ruled by red-haired feminists. We are not. That's not the case. Like, you have these people coming out, and I think ultimately you have a case where these people are sort of like the cannon fodder of the establishment. Like, they are sent out to attack average people and to make your life like they're almost out there, like the red-haired feminist is sort of out there to make Hillary Clinton look good, if that makes sense. All these people who just nag, like their whole existence is all about nagging. They're there to make Joe Biden seem like a moderate guy. Like, you want to have a beer with Joe Biden. Even though Joe Biden's like a radical, post-communist neoliberal. Like, he's just a very weird guy. Wouldn't want to have a beer with Joe Biden. But people like the red-haired feminist are out there to make Joe Biden seem moderate. That's the left's way of pushing the Overton window. But ultimately, we aren't ruled by the red-haired feminists. We're ruled by people like Joe Biden. And Joe Biden sees the red-haired feminist as a tool. But that's all that she ever is going to be. The fat red-haired feminist, all she's ever going to be is a tool for people like Joe Biden. Right? The Me Too movement was a tool. The Me Too movement doesn't have any of its own power. And when you use tools, you use weapons, sometimes there's blowback. And so I'm not saying that necessarily that there's some kind of central, or there's like one person who's like king of the world and he created feminism, which is, I guess, like the Christian view of Satan, right? Satan created feminism. But I don't see it that way. I see it that there's a global capitalist neural network, in the sense that you have a global capitalist economy which has a communication linguistics to it and a semiotics to it, and it's communicating in real time, and it creates tools like feminism to achieve its ends. Feminism gets women into the workplace, it nags men, it creates all kinds of obstacles and problems for the average man, so he's focused on dealing with this issue of feminism rather than dealing with bigger structural issues. But feminism doesn't run the show. Nothing originates with feminism. Feminism is a product. Feminism is a consequence. Feminism is a symptom of capitalism. Capitalism created feminism for its own ends. So to attack feminism seems sort of silly, because, I mean, you could spend, again, all these things. It's like if someone was burning down your house every night you wake and the fire alarm's going off, and you go downstairs in the kitchen and there's a fire in the kitchen, and every night you take your fire extinguisher and you put it out every single night. And you put out this fire and you never ask, well, what's the structural problem here? Maybe there's a structural problem with your gas line. Maybe there's a structural problem with the fact that your door is unlocked and someone keeps coming in your house every night and throwing matches on the burner. Right, so there are structural problems in society that create little fires. Those fires are things like immigration, Muslim immigration, welfare usage, feminism. We have all these little fires, and the conservative movement, and even these white nationalists, these people on the right, is that they're running around putting out these little fires without ever questioning what is the structural element. And I guess for some people they're able to simplify the structural element to Jewish people, but I think Jewish people are just good at fitting a niche that capitalism has created. Capitalism, it was necessary to have people like Oliver Cromwell, is necessary to have people like Henry VIII to create a capitalist system to destroy the traditional relationship between church and state and give rise to a new mercantile class, and Jews filled that role. It's not that they created that role. They filled a role in a system that was created, for people like them. But anyone can fill that role. I mean, in Mexico, Lebanese people fill that role to an extent. In Malaysia, Chinese people fill that role. So it doesn't need to be. Jews are just good. I mean, in the same way that Nordic people are good at strongman competitions. Like Nordic people, people from Northern Europe, Slavic people. You have Bulgarians and Russians and Icelandic people. These people are good in bodybuilding and strongman competitions. I mean, they're good at lifting like giant boulders over their heads and throwing them. These people are really good. I mean, the Irish and the Scottish, they're just physically strong people. They're built for this kind of physical activity. And so it doesn't mean that they're the only people who are strong, and it doesn't mean that only they can be strong. And if we just got rid of all the Icelandic people, there would be no more strong men in the world. That's not true. In the same way, if we just got rid of all the Jewish people, there would be no more capitalism. That's not true either. The system that's in place creates opportunities, creates niches, and people who then reach out and they fill those niches. They're just filling a power vacuum. And without those people, it would be someone else, right? So, you have to look at the system, the structural system. Now, someone who's really anti-capitalist would say, oh, we can have another system. There's got to be another system. Maybe we can have a system based on personality. Or maybe we can have a system based on religion. So we could be a theocracy. National Socialism said we should have state ruled by a leader, and we should have a cult of personality. I mean, literally, they said we should have rule by personalities. We should have instead of a Finanzsystem, we should have a state ruled by a single person, and their personality will define the character of the state. So, I mean, you could propose alternative systems that really do change the entire structure of the economy. But you have to do it on that level, ultimately, because otherwise you're just putting out a little fire and you're going to end up exactly where you are. And that's my problem with most conservatives and most of these white nationalist thinkers. And they think, like, we just have to get rid of a certain ethnic group and then, we won't have these problems anymore. All I'm saying is that different ethnic groups have different propensities for fulfilling different roles within the capitalist system. And so you get rid of a specific ethnic group, and that's not going to change the overall structure of the system. It's just going to eliminate one player in the system. Well, someone else is going to come along and fulfill that role. Even if you eliminate one player, the game is still going on. We're still playing the capitalist game. Now, if you like the capitalist game and you're just competing with other people in the capitalist game, that's a different question. But then why would you be advocating white nationalism? Doesn't really make sense. So I don't think people are really seeing the big picture. I don't think they're really understanding what's actually going on. So, if you have a genuine, deep critique of capitalism, make it. And you have an alternative system, make it. And then propose how are we going to get from point A, which is capitalism, to point B, which is like your theocracy or your cult of personality or whatever. Tell me how we're going to get from point A to point B in this system, in the context of capitalism, because I can tell you how we got from a Neolithic state, theocratic states, how we got from a Neolithic period to a post-Neolithic period. I can explain that history. It's going to be difficult for me. It might take many videos, and maybe I'm going to have to flesh out the details, and I've learned things in the past that I've now forgotten, and there's fuzzy edges to my memory. But I can do that, and that's what I endeavor to do in the future. But I don't think a lot of people can tell me how we're going to get from point A to point B in terms of how we're going to get from post-Neolithic back to the Neolithic. Because that's what they're proposing. And I say, well, you're basically, to one degree or another, you are on the same wavelength as Ted Kaczynski. You just haven't gone full Kaczynski. You're just like lukewarm Kaczynski. And so I'm saying, well, have you really considered the full logical implications of what you're saying? You're saying that the current present state of affairs is a staccato event, and that we're just going to naturally, organically, the pendulum will just swing back to how it was before. But is that really the case? I mean, was that the case with the Neolithic Revolution? I don't think so. So prove to me that this is a staccato event. Prove to me that this is an isolated period in history and we're just going to swing back to traditionalism. Because I don't see the proof for that. In fact, I see a lot of proof to the contrary. And, if that's the case, again, you either have to show me A to B how that's going to be the case, or you have to say, well, maybe we just have to accept that things have really changed. And we have to understand that still the dominant influence in our economy is our instincts, our Paleolithic, our Neolithic instincts. We're not going to escape that. We still need friends. We need sex. We need leaders. We need people we can look up to. We need religious systems, mimetic systems. So we need all these things in order to survive psychologically. If we don't have these things, we become antisocial, we become unproductive, we tend toward addictions, we tend toward escapism, we tend toward fantasy. And so if you want to make an impact in the world, you have to address your instincts, and you have to live in a way that's in harmony with instincts. If you want to call that traditionalism, fine. By that definition, I am a traditionalist. But in the sense of functional traditionalism, there's a difference between psychological traditionalism, which is saying that psychologically we're built to be traditionalists, and so we have to satisfy our traditional instincts to an extent in order to function at a basic level. Most people. Some people might be able to live in a constant orgy, drug-filled orgy. Rock stars might be able to do that, but most people cannot. You or me probably cannot do that, and have at all any kind of hope of functioning. And so we do need to stay away from drugs, and we do need to temper our instincts and live according to some kind of within some kind of traditionalist framework. But at the same time, there's a difference between, again, what I would call that pragmatic psychological traditionalism and then a functional traditionalism or a teleological traditionalism of this is how it should be. I don't think we should be traditionalists in the sense that I don't think traditionalism is ultimately where we will end up. I don't think we will be living in a traditionalist Neolithic society in 100, 200 years. But I think that we need to address psychological traditionalism. I think people who ignore psychological traditionalism cause themselves huge amounts of pain, huge amounts of harm. I think people on the left who reject traditionalism, who do have this tabula rasa concept of human psychology, are totally wrong, and I think they are harming themselves and they're harming other people. I think they are miserable, and I think their suicide rate is high. So I think people have to understand and be realistic with the concept of traditionalism. So again, I call it a psychological traditionalism as opposed to a teleological traditionalism. And maybe that should be the title of the video. I don't know. In any case, I've gone full, well over the limit, and that's way too much information for anyone to possibly comprehend and digest. And feel free to hone in on one little thing that I said and pick it apart and nitpick it and thumbs down the video. So in any case, it was good talking to you guys, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.